He built an empire on fear, broke every man who dared look him in the eye, took what he wanted, burned what he didn't. King Darius Blackthorn answered to no one, until the night his own queen dragged his darkest secret into the throne hall and made him answer to everyone. What happened next didn't just destroy a king, it rewrote what power means. Stay with me through every twist, every betrayal, every moment this man's world collapses around him. Drop a like if this story hooks you. And comment the name of your city. I want to know where my people are watching from tonight. The last candle in this eastern corridor had barely been lit when the first carriages rolled through the palace gates, horses stamped against wet cobblestone. Footmen in gold-trimmed coats stood rigid along the path, their breath rising in thin clouds as the autumn air settled over the capital like a damp cloth. Inside the grand hall, 300 seats waited beneath a ceiling painted with battles no living person remembered. Crystal chandeliers threw fractured light across marble floors, polished to a mirror finish. Servants moved between tables carrying silver trays of roasted game, candied figs, and wine dark enough to stain stone. This was the imperial banquet of the Harvest Court, held once every 3 years in honor of the royal mother empress. Every noble house in the Blackthorn Dominion was expected to attend. Expected, not invited. There was a difference. An invitation implied choice. Under King Darius Blackthorn's rule, no such thing existed. Queen Celine Ashford stood before a mirror in her private chambers, while 2 attendants fastened the clasps of a midnight blue gown along her spine. The fabric pulled tight across her shoulders. She had lost weight again. Not from illness, not from vanity. From the particular kind of erosion that happens to a body when it spends 7 years bracing for impact that never comes from the same direction twice. She studied her own reflection, the way a general studies a battlefield the morning before everything goes wrong. Pale skin stretched thin over sharp cheekbones. Dark circles she had stopped trying to powder away. And eyes. Flat, steady, drained of the warmth they carried in portraits painted during her first year as queen. Those portraits hung in a hallway she no longer walked through. One of the attendants, a girl no older than 16, fumbled with the final clasp. Her fingers trembled. "You're shaking," Celine said. Not a question. "Forgive me, Your Grace. I haven't served at an imperial banquet before." "There's nothing to forgive. Your hands will steady once you realize nothing in that hall can hurt you worse than your own fear of it." Celine paused. She watched the girl's reflection blink. "That's not comfort. That's just how it works." The girl nodded and finished the clasp without another fumble. Celine turned from the mirror. She pulled a thin leather case from the drawer of her vanity, the kind used for carrying documents sealed with wax. She tucked it into the folds of her gown where the fabric gathered at the hip. The case pressed flat against her body, invisible beneath the drape of silk. No one asked what it contained. No one in Celine's chambers asked questions anymore. They had learned, slowly and through pain, that knowing things in this palace was a liability that could cost a person more than their position. The corridor leading to the grand hall was lined with portraits of Blackthorn kings going back 14 generations. Every face wore the same expression, jaw set, eyes forward, mouth pressed into something between authority and contempt. Darius had been painted 3 times since taking the throne. Each version showed him broader in the shoulders, sharper in the jaw, and further from anything that looked human. Celine walked the corridor alone. Her attendants had been dismissed at the staircase. She preferred it this way. The silence gave her room to think, and tonight she needed every inch of that room. She had spent 4 months building the contents of that leather case. 4 months of intercepted letters, bribed couriers, copied ledgers, and sleepless nights cross-referencing dates against the palace physician's logs. What she carried was not suspicion. Suspicion was cheap. Everyone in the palace had suspicion. What she carried was proof, and proof in this court was the only weapon that drew blood without touching a blade. The grand hall erupted in noise the moment the doors opened. Laughter, the clink of crystal, the low hum of 300 conversations happening at once, all of it layered beneath the string quartet playing from a balcony above the eastern wing. Nobles in silk and velvet stood in clusters, each group angled toward the center of the room where the raised dais held the royal table. King Darius Blackthorn sat at the head of that table like a man who had personally carved the chair from the bones of his enemies. He was tall, taller than most men in the kingdom, with a jaw that could have been cut from granite and shoulders that strained against the gold-embroidered fabric of his coat. His dark hair was swept back, oiled and gleaming under the chandelier light. His hands rested on the table, thick-knuckled and scarred across the left. a reminder of the duel that had secured his claim to the throne 12 years earlier when his older brother challenged the succession and lost both the fight and his life. Darius was laughing. That was the first thing Celine noticed as she entered. The way his head tilted back, the way his teeth caught the light, the way the sound of it rolled across the hall like distant thunder. He was laughing at something Lord Cravensfield had said, though Cravensfield himself looked more terrified than amused, the way men always looked when they accidentally made the king laugh, and couldn't be sure if the laughter would turn on them. To the king's right sat the royal mother empress, Isolde Blackthorne. 73 years old, spine straight as a blade, silver hair pinned beneath a crown of black iron and sapphires that had been worn by every reigning empress for 2 centuries. Her face was a mask of practiced neutrality, the kind that took decades to perfect. She watched the hall the way an owl watches a field. Still, patient, missing nothing. To the king's left, and this was the thing that made Celine's stomach clench even though she had expected it, sat Lady Evelyn Marchand. 26 years old, auburn hair falling in waves across bare shoulders, a dress of pale gold that shimmered when she breathed. She was supposed to be sitting 3 rows back, among the attendants and minor court ladies. Instead, she occupied the seat that protocol dictated belonged to the queen. Celine's seat, the room noticed. Celine could feel it in the way conversation stuttered as she passed, the way eyes darted between her and the dais, and then quickly looked away. No one said anything. No one ever said anything in this court. Words were currency, and spending them on the obvious was considered wasteful. Celine climbed the 3 steps to the dais without hurrying. Her gown whispered against the stone. She stopped beside the table, close enough that Darius would have to acknowledge her presence. He didn't. He continued his conversation with Cravensfield, one hand wrapped around a goblet of wine, the other resting on the arm of his chair with the kind of deliberate casualness that took effort to maintain. Your Majesty. Celine's voice was calm. I believe there has been a seating arrangement. Darius turned his head slowly. The laughter drained from his face the way color drains from a man who steps on a snake. He looked at her with an expression she had catalogued 100 times. Not anger, not contempt, but something worse. Inconvenience. She was an inconvenience, a door that creaked, a stain on a tablecloth. You're late, he said. I am precisely on time. The seating, however, appears to have been rearranged without my knowledge. Evelyn shifted in her chair. She did not stand. She did not look at Celine. Instead, she reached for her wine glass and took a measured sip, her eyes fixed on some invisible point across the hall. It was a performance, rehearsed, deliberate, designed to communicate a single message. I belong here, and you do not. Darius leaned back. Sit wherever you like, Celine. There are 300 chairs in this room. A ripple moved through the nearest tables. Lord Ashworth, seated 4 places down, pressed his napkin to his mouth. Lady Pemberton stared at her plate. The Mother Empress's eyes moved from Darius to Celine and held there, unblinking. Celine did not sit wherever she liked. She pulled the empty chair at the far end of the royal table, the chair traditionally reserved for visiting ambassadors, and positioned it directly across from Evelyn. She sat down without waiting for a servant to assist her, the leather case pressed against her hip. Thank you, Celine said. This will do perfectly. Darius's jaw tightened. He hadn't expected her to stay. He had expected what she always did, the quiet retreat, the lowered eyes, the dignified withdrawal that everyone in court had mistaken for weakness, because they had never been close enough to see that it was strategy. The banquet proceeded. 7 courses. Roasted pheasant, poached pear salad, braised venison in a sauce of crushed juniper and black wine. Each course arrived with ceremony. Silver cloches lifted in unison, steam rising in theatrical plumes. Darius ate with appetite. Evelyn ate with the careful precision of someone who had been taught which fork to use but still thought about it before reaching. The Mother Empress ate nothing. She sipped broth from a porcelain cup and watched the room the way she had watched rooms for 50 years, with the understanding that every banquet was also an audit. Celine ate nothing either. She sat with her hands folded in her lap, her plate untouched, her wine glass filled but not lifted. She watched. Not the room, not the guests. She watched Darius and Evelyn the way a hunter watches the last 2 animals before the trap closes. It was between the 5th and 6th course that Darius made the mistake. He reached beneath the table and squeezed Evelyn's hand. It lasted 2 seconds. Maybe 3. A gesture so small that in any other room it would have been invisible. But the Mother Empress was not in any other room. She was in her room. And she saw it. Isolde set down her porcelain cup with a click that cut through the ambient noise like a gunshot through fog. Conversations at the nearest tables stopped. Then the next row. Then the next. Within 30 seconds, the entire hall had gone quiet, except for the string quartet, which played 3 more bars before the first violinist noticed the silence and signaled the others to stop. Darius. The Mother Empress's voice carried without volume. It was the kind of voice that had been obeyed for so long it no longer needed to raise itself. Explain to me why Lady Marchand is sitting at the royal table. Darius straightened. His hand withdrew from beneath the table. She is here as my personal guest, Mother. Your personal guest sits among the court, not beside the crown. Protocol allows for exceptions at the king's discretion. Protocol allows for nothing of the sort. I wrote the protocol. Isolde's eyes shifted to Evelyn. Lady Marchand stand. Evelyn stood. Her chin was high, but her hands were pressed flat against her thighs, the knuckles white beneath the candlelight. She was afraid. She was very good at hiding it. Years of court training had taught her how to arrange her face into something that resembled composure, but her body betrayed her. The tendons in her neck pulled taut. Her breathing was shallow and fast, the kind of breathing that precedes either flight or collapse. You serve the queen, the Mother Empress said. You attend her wardrobe. You manage her correspondence. These are your duties, assigned by charter. By what authority did you abandon those duties to sit at the king's table? By the king's invitation, your imperial grace. The king does not have the authority to reassign a queen's personal attendant. That authority belongs to the queen. Isolde turned to Celine. Did you release Lady Marchand from her duties this evening? Celine looked at Evelyn. She let the silence hold for 3 full seconds before she spoke. Long enough for every person in the hall to lean forward, long enough for Darius's fingers to tighten around his goblet until the metal creaked. I did not. The hall exhaled. Not a sound, more like a collective shift in pressure, the way air moves before a storm reaches the ground. Darius pushed back from the table. This is absurd. I will not have my banquet disrupted over a seating arrangement. Then you should not have disrupted the seating arrangement, Isolde said. Celine could feel the room pivoting, not toward her, not yet, but away from Darius, which was almost the same thing. She pressed her hand against the leather case at her hip and took a breath that filled her lungs for what felt like the first time in months. With respect to the Mother Empress, Celine said, and her voice did not shake. The seating arrangement is not the issue. Silence. Complete and absolute. Even the servants stopped moving. The issue, Celine continued, is that Lady Evelyn Marchand has been sharing the king's bed for the past 2 years, and the court has been instructed to pretend otherwise. The sound that followed was not gasps. It was not whispers. It was the particular kind of noise that happens when 300 people try to react, and then immediately suppress that reaction, because they are not sure yet whether reacting will get them killed. It was a rustle, like dry leaves turning in wind. Darius was on his feet. His chair scraped back against the stone dais with a sound like tearing metal. His face had gone from composure to fury in the space of a single heartbeat. Nostrils flared, veins rising along his temples, the cords in his neck standing rigid beneath the skin. You will be silent, he said. I have been silent for 7 years. Tonight I am done being silent. I am your king. Then act like one. The words landed like a slap. Darius flinched. Not visibly. Not in the way that anyone further than 10 feet would notice. But Celine saw it. She saw the micro-tremor in his jaw, the fraction of a second blink, the way his weight shifted backward before he caught himself. She had never spoken to him like that. Not once. Not in private. Not in the dark hours when he came to her chambers smelling of another woman's perfume and dared her to say something about it. She had swallowed every insult, catalogued every humiliation, filed every wound in the archive of her patience. And she had done it on purpose, because she understood something that Darius never would. Silence was not surrender. Silence was preparation. The Mother Empress had not moved. Her expression had not changed. But her eyes, those sharp, depthless eyes that had watched 3 kings rise and 2 of them fall, were locked on Celine with an intensity that bordered on recognition, as if she were seeing her for the first time, as if she were recalculating everything she had ever assumed about the woman her son had married. Evelyn stepped back from the table. Her composure was cracking now. The mask slipping at the edges, the rehearsed dignity giving way to something rawer. She looked at Darius. Not for reassurance, for instruction. She looked at him the way a soldier looks at a general when the battle plan has failed and no one has issued a retreat. Darius did not look at her. His eyes were fixed on Celine with the kind of hatred that only comes from being exposed by someone you believed was too weak to threaten you. You have no evidence of anything, he said. His voice was low. Not the booming authority he used in council chambers, but the quiet, dangerous register he reserved for moments when the real threats emerged. You are making accusations based on gossip and jealousy, and you will retract them Before you what? Celine reached into the folds of her gown and withdrew the leather case. She held it in front of her, not offering it, not opening it, just holding it the way a person holds a weapon they have already decided to use. Before you do what you always do, threaten, intimidate, order someone dragged away in the middle of the night and tell the court they were reassigned to a distant province? She opened the case. Inside were 12 sheets of parchment, each sealed with different wax: red, black, green, the colors of various ministerial offices. She laid them on the table one by one, fanning them across the white linen like a hand of cards dealt in a game no one else knew they were playing. Correspondence between Lord Chancellor Thorne and the royal physician, dated 14 months ago, requesting a specific compound from the eastern provinces. Testimony from 2 palace servants who witnessed Lady Marchand entering the king's private chambers on 43 separate occasions over an 18-month period. Financial records showing payments made from the king's personal treasury to a property in the merchant district, a property currently registered under a false name, but occupied by Lady Marchand's mother and younger sister. Celine's voice was flat, clinical. She was not performing. She was presenting evidence. And this, she lifted the final document, a letter in the king's own hand, sealed with his personal signet, addressed to Evelyn. The contents describe, in considerable detail, plans to secure the succession in favor of any child born between them, regardless of legitimacy. Darius lunged, not toward Celine, toward the documents. His hand swept across the table, knocking goblets and plates aside in a crash of silver and glass that echoed off the vaulted ceiling. But Celine had anticipated this. She had already stepped back, the documents pulled to her chest, the final letter held high above the wreckage. "Guards," she said. 4 royal guards moved from their positions along the wall. They did not draw weapons. They simply moved, stepping between Darius and Celine with the practiced efficiency of men who had been briefed beforehand. Men who had received their orders not from the king, but from the queen. Darius stared at them. Something shifted behind his eyes. Something between disbelief and the first cold touch of understanding. His own guards. His personal security. Standing between him and his wife, with their hands on their pommels and their eyes locked forward. "What is this?" he whispered. "This is the consequence you never planned for," Celine said, "because you never believed I was capable of planning at all." The Mother Empress rose to her feet. The movement was slow. Age demanded that, but it carried the weight of an institution. When Isolde Blackthorn stood, the room stood with her. 300 chairs scraped backward in near unison as every noble, lord, and minister rose in deference. "Continue," Isolde said to Celine. It was not permission, it was a command, and for the first time in 7 years that command was directed not at the king, but at the queen. Celine turned to face the hall. She held the documents against her chest the way a mother holds a child she has fought to protect, not with tenderness, but with the ferocity of someone who understands that dropping them would mean losing everything. "I did not come here tonight to humiliate anyone," she said. "I came because the alternative was silence, and silence in this court has cost more lives than any war." She turned to Evelyn. The younger woman had not moved from where she stood beside her overturned chair. Her pale gold dress was stained with wine from the goblets Darius had knocked aside. Red spread across the fabric like a wound. Her hands hung at her sides. She was shaking. "Lady Marchand," Celine said, "you have served this court in the Queen's household for 4 years. During that time, you used your position to access correspondence meant for my eyes alone. You intercepted messages from allies who might have warned me of the King's activities. You filed false reports about my health to the royal physician, suggesting instability of mind, in an effort to build a case for my removal from the throne. And you did all of this while standing 3 feet from me every morning, helping me dress, pouring my tea, asking about my sleep as if you cared whether I lived or died." Eveline's chin dropped. Her eyes went to the floor. For the first time since Celine had known her. 4 years of daily proximity, 4 years of the woman's practiced smile and careful deference. Evelyn looked exactly like what she was. Not a courtesan, not a schemer. A woman in her 20s who had gambled everything on a man who was watching his own survival flash before his eyes and had already stopped calculating how to save her. "I did what I was told," Evelyn said. Her voice cracked on the last word. "By whom?" Evelyn looked at Darius. He stood behind the wall of guards, his chest heaving, his face a landscape of fury and panic that no crown could disguise. She looked at him the way someone looks at the last bridge they're about to burn. By the king, she said. The hall erupted, not in an organized way, not the structured murmur of political surprise, but in a jagged human eruption of voices, chairs scraping, hands slamming tables. Lord Ashworth stood and pointed at Darius with a trembling finger. Lady Pemberton covered her face. 3 ministers in the eastern wing began arguing simultaneously, their voices overlapping like waves breaking against each other. Silence. The Mother Empress did not shout. She spoke the word once, at the same volume she had used all evening, and the room obeyed as if she had pulled a lever that controlled every throat in the building. Lady Marchand, Isolde said, you will clarify your statement. The king instructed you to conduct espionage against the queen. Evelyn swallowed. Her throat moved visibly. Yes, your Imperial Grace. When did these instructions begin? Before I was placed in the queen's household. The assignment. It was the reason I was placed there. Another silence. This one different from the others. Heavier. The kind of silence that fills a room when everyone in it realizes simultaneously that the ground they are standing on is not solid and never was. Celine felt it too. She had known about the affair. She had known about the financial records and the intercepted correspondence. But she had not known, not with certainty, that Evelyn had been a plant from the beginning, that the woman who had buttoned her dresses and braided her hair and listened to her cry on the nights when the loneliness was so deep it felt like drowning had been reporting every tear to the man who caused them. Something moved in Celine's chest. Not grief. She was past grief. It was something colder and sharper, the recognition that the betrayal was even more complete than she had calculated, that even her most paranoid estimates had underestimated the depth of her husband's contempt. She steadied herself, pressed her feet flat against the stone floor and felt the cold seep through the soles of her shoes. She needed that cold. It kept the rage below the surface where it could be useful instead of destructive. I have one more question for Lady Marchand, Celine said, and I want the court to hear the answer. The Mother Empress nodded. Celine turned back to Evelyn. She took one step closer, close enough to see the pulse hammering in the younger woman's neck, close enough to smell the jasmine oil Evelyn always wore because Darius preferred it over the rosewater Celine used. The royal physician's compound, the one Lord Chancellor Thorne ordered from the eastern provinces 14 months ago. Celine's voice dropped, not to a whisper, to the register just above it, the register that forces a room of 300 people to hold their breath to hear. What was it used for? Evelyn's eyes went wide. The shaking in her hand spread to her arms, her shoulders, her jaw. She opened her mouth and no sound came out. She tried again. Nothing. Answer the question, the Mother Empress said. Evelyn closed her eyes. A single tear broke free and carved a line through the powder on her left cheek. When she opened her eyes again, she was not looking at Celine. She was not looking at the Mother Empress. She was looking straight ahead, at no one, at the empty space between her body and the nearest wall, the way a person looks when they have decided to step off a ledge and the only thing left is the fall. It was a poison, she said. The hall did not erupt this time. It froze. 300 people turned to stone, a slow-acting compound, undetectable in food or drink. It was introduced to the nursery stores over a period of 6 months. Evelyn's voice was mechanical now, stripped of inflection, stripped of self-preservation, stripped of everything except the compulsion to finally stop carrying the weight of what she knew. 3 royal heirs developed symptoms that were attributed to seasonal fever. 2 survived with permanent damage to their lungs. 1 did not survive. Celine's hand closed into a fist. Her nails bit into her palm hard enough to draw blood. The youngest heir, Prince Aldrich, 3 years old, had died in his sleep during the winter fever outbreak. The court had mourned for a week. Darius had delivered a eulogy that made grown men weep, and Celine had stood beside the tiny coffin and felt something inside her fracture so completely that she thought she would never be able to breathe again without feeling the edges of the break scraping together. Prince Aldrich was not her son. He was Darius's child from his first consort, who had died in childbirth. But Celine had raised him. She had been the one who sang to him when the nightmares came. She had been the one whose face he looked for when he was frightened. And when they told her he was gone, she had felt the loss in a place so deep that no amount of court composure could reach it. And now she knew. It was not a fever. It was not a tragedy. It was a decision, made by the man who had eulogized his own son while the poison was still being cleaned from the nursery stores. You killed children, Celine said. The words came out quiet, not controlled. Quiet the way a thing is quiet right before it detonates. You murdered the heirs to the throne to protect a succession that doesn't exist, to clear a path for an illegitimate child that hasn't even been born. Eveline's hand moved to her stomach. Instinct, protective. And in that gesture, the entire court understood what Celine was saying. Eveline was carrying the king's child. The affair was not merely an affair, it was a succession plan built on dead children and forged documents, and a woman who had been planted in the queen's household like a blade hidden in silk. Darius moved. He shoved past the guards, shoulder-checking the nearest one hard enough to stagger him, and crossed the dais in 3 strides. But he did not go toward Celine. He went to Eveline. He grabbed her by the shoulders and pulled her against his chest, wrapping his arms around her the way a man wraps himself around the last thing he cannot afford to lose. And then King Darius Blackthorn, Alpha of the realm, the man who had broken lords and burned provinces and ruled through a fear so absolute it had its own gravity, did something no one in the hall had ever seen him do. He dropped to his knees. He dropped to his knees on the stone floor of the grand hall, clutching Eveline Marchand against him, his face buried in the fabric of her wine-stained dress, and he wept. Not the dignified, single-tear performance of a man playing at grief. He sobbed. Deep, broken, animal sounds that came from somewhere beneath the armor of 12 years of tyranny. Sounds that did not belong to a king, sounds that belonged to a man who had just realized that the only thing in the world he actually wanted was about to be taken from him, and no amount of power could stop it. Please, his voice was wrecked, raw, stripped of every ounce of authority. Celine, please. She's carrying my child. Whatever you want from me, whatever you need, I will give it. The throne, the treasury. My name, take all of it. But don't touch her. Don't touch the child. The hall was silent. Not frozen this time, watching. 300 people watching a king beg. 300 people recalibrating everything they had ever believed about the man on his knees. About the woman standing over him. About the empire that had been built on the back of his cruelty and the foundation of her silence. Celine looked down at him. At the man she had married 7 years ago in a ceremony that lasted 4 hours and felt like a sentencing. At the man who had never once asked how she slept, how she felt, what she needed. At the man whose hand she had held at a child's funeral, while that same hand signed the orders that put the child in the ground. She felt nothing, not triumph, not satisfaction, not even anger. She felt the absence of something, the absence of the person she used to be, the version of herself that might have knelt beside him and said yes, might have accepted the trade, might have chosen mercy, because mercy was what good queens were supposed to choose. That woman was dead. Darius had killed her slowly, over 7 years, and he hadn't even noticed. Celine stepped past him. She walked to the edge of the dais and turned to face the court. Behind her, the king sobbed on his knees with his mistress in his arms. Before her, 300 faces stared upward, waiting. The evidence I have presented tonight will be entered into the imperial record at the order of the Mother Empress, Celine said. I am requesting a full investigation into the deaths and injuries of the royal heirs, the misuse of the king's treasury, the espionage conducted against the queen's household, and any additional crimes uncovered in the course of that investigation. She paused. Let the weight of it settle. And I am requesting that this investigation begin tonight, before dawn, before anyone in this room has the opportunity to destroy evidence, flee the capital, or send word to whatever network of accomplices enabled this treason to continue for 2 years under the roof of the imperial palace. The Mother Empress stepped forward. She moved to the edge of the dais beside Celine and looked out at the court with an expression that could have been carved from the same stone as the palace walls. Granted, she said. 1 word. That was all it took. 1 word from the woman who had sat on the throne before Darius was born, who had outlasted 2 kings in a civil war and an assassination attempt that had left her with a scar along her collarbone she still refused to cover. Commander Aldrin, the Mother Empress said. From the far wall, a man in black armor stepped forward. He was the head of the Imperial Guard, not the king's personal detail, but the guard that answered directly to the throne's charter, which placed ultimate military authority not with the reigning monarch, but with the Mother Empress in matters of internal security. Seal the palace, Isolde said. No one enters or leaves until the investigation is complete. Secure the king's private chambers, the queen's household records, Lord Chancellor Thorne's offices, and the royal physician's laboratory. Any person who attempts to remove documents from the palace will be detained. Commander Aldrin bowed once and turned on his heel. The sound of boots echoed through the corridor outside. A dozen, then 2 dozen, then more, as the order rippled outward through the palace guard like a wave that would not stop until it reached every gate, every door, every shadow. Darius lifted his head, His face was a ruin, eyes swollen, cheeks streaked, mouth twisted in an expression caught between rage and desperation. He still held Evelyn, who had gone limp in his arms, her head resting against his shoulder with the blank stillness of a person who has stopped processing what is happening around them. "Mother," Darius said, his voice cracked on the word. "Mother, you cannot do this. I am the king. This is my court, my palace. Your palace stands on my charter," Isolde said. She did not look at him. "Your crown sits on my authority, and your reign continues at my discretion. I suggest you remember that before you tell me what I cannot do." Darius's mouth opened, closed, opened again. No sound came out. For the first time in his reign, perhaps for the first time in his life, King Darius Blackthorn had nothing to say. Not because he lacked words, but because he had finally encountered a situation where words could not save him. Where charm, intimidation, threats, and violence were all equally useless. Where the only currency that mattered was the truth, and he had spent years making sure he had none of it. Celine watched him from the edge of the dais. She watched the way his grip on Evelyn tightened, the way his shoulders shook, the way his knees ground against the cold stone, as if the pain of it could anchor him to a reality that was disintegrating beneath him. She watched the most powerful man in the empire finally understand what it felt like to be powerless, and then she turned away. Not dramatically, not with a final look or a parting word. She turned the way a person turns from something that no longer concerns them, the way you turn from a fire that has already burned everything it was going to burn. She walked down the steps of the dais, through the silent hall, past 300 faces that would never look at her the same way again, past the guards who parted for her without being told, past the portrait corridor where 14 generations of Blackthorn kings stared down from their frames with the same expression of authority and contempt. She did not look at them. She walked to the end of the corridor where the staircase led upward to her private chambers. She stopped, one hand on the stone railing, the leather case empty now, the documents left behind on the table where the investigation would begin. Her hand was shaking. Not her voice, not her face, not her posture, those had held. But her hand, alone in the dim corridor where no one could see it, trembled against the stone with the force of everything she had held inside for 7 years finally beginning to break loose. She tightened her grip until the trembling stopped. She had one more document, one she had not presented. One that was not in the leather case because it was not part of the financial records or the correspondence or the testimony. It was a separate piece of evidence entirely, a letter she had found sewn into the lining of a coat that belonged to the king, discovered 3 weeks ago when a loyal servant had brought it to her in the dead of night. A letter that mentioned her brother, her younger brother, Lord Edric Ashford, who had died 6 years ago in a riding accident on the Northern Road. An accident witnessed by 2 of the king's personal guards. An accident that had been investigated for 3 days, declared unfortunate, and never spoken of again. The letter in Celine's possession, written in Darius's hand, addressed to a name she did not recognize, contained a single sentence that had made her sit down on the floor of her chambers and press her fist against her mouth until the scream burning in her throat dissolved into something she could swallow. The sentence read, "The Ashford problem on the Northern Road has been resolved. Ensure the witnesses understand the cost of remembering." Celine released the railing. She climbed the stairs. Behind her, the palace churned with the sound of boots and locked doors, and an empire rearranging itself around the revelation that its king was a murderer, its queen was awake, and the dawn that was coming would not look like any dawn that had come before. She reached her chambers, closed the door, pressed her back against it, and slid to the floor. Tomorrow she would present the letter about Edric. Tomorrow she would watch whatever was left of Darius's defense collapse into dust. Tomorrow, the court would learn that the king had not only poisoned heirs and planted spies, but had murdered the queen's blood to keep her isolated, controllable, alone. But tonight, just for this one moment, in the dark, on the floor, with no crown, and no audience, and no strategy left to execute, Celine Ashford allowed herself to grieve the brother she had lost, and the years she could never recover, and the woman she had been forced to become in order to survive the man she had married. The tears came without sound. She had learned, long ago, to cry without making noise. In the grand hall below, King Darius Blackthorn still knelt on the cold stone floor, clutching a woman who could not save him, surrounded by guards who no longer answered to him, beneath the gaze of a mother who had just decided that her son's reign was over. He did not yet know about the letter. He did not yet know that the worst was still coming. Orchestrated cinematic screenplay continuation, adhering to technical specifications and narrative depth requirements. Orchestrated cinematic screenplay, continuation adhering to technical specifications and narrative depth requirements. The corridor outside the grand hall smelled like cold stone and spilled wine. Commander Aldrin's boots struck the marble in a rhythm that hadn't changed pace since the Mother Empress gave the order. Steady, deliberate, the cadence of a man who understood that the next 6 hours would determine whether the Empire held together or split at the seams like a ship hitting rock. He posted 4 guards at every exit, 2 at each window on the ground floor, 6 in the courtyard where the carriages waited, their drivers already nervous, already whispering to each other in the language of men who can feel the current shifting beneath them. Inside the grand hall, 300 nobles sat in a silence so thick it had texture. No one had left. Not because they couldn't. The doors were sealed, but the truth was simpler than that. No one wanted to miss what came next. Power was collapsing in real time, and every person in that room understood that what they witnessed tonight would dictate their position in whatever came after. Darius was still on the floor, not kneeling anymore, sitting. His legs had given out somewhere in the minutes after Celine left, and he had crumpled sideways against the base of the royal table, with Evelyn pressed against him, her face buried in his chest, her body shaking in waves that came and went like contractions. His coat was stained with wine and tears, and the particular grime that accumulates on a man who has spent the last 20 minutes on a stone floor he has never been lower than in his life. The Mother Empress had not sat back down. She stood at the edge of the dais, hands folded at her waist, watching the hall with the patience of a woman who had learned decades ago that the most important thing you can do after lighting a fire is stand still and observe what runs. "Lord Chancellor Thorn," she said. A man near the center of the hall flinched so hard he knocked his wine glass off the table. Thorn was 58, thin as a whip, with a face that had been designed by decades of bureaucratic survival to express nothing. Tonight that face was the color of wet chalk. "Your Imperial Grace, you will accompany Commander Aldrin to your offices. You will open every locked drawer, every sealed cabinet, every secured vault. If a single document is found to have been removed or destroyed, I will hold you personally accountable." Thorn stood. His chair didn't scrape. He lifted it carefully, the way a man handles everything when he knows that any sudden movement might be interpreted as guilt. "I have nothing to hide, Your Imperial Grace." "Then you have nothing to fear from an open office." Thorn walked toward the door. His steps were measured, his spine rigid. But halfway across the hall, his hand went to his coat pocket. A movement so brief and automatic that it could have been nothing, could have been habit, could have been a man reaching for a handkerchief. Commander Aldrin caught it. He stepped into Thorn's path and extended his hand, palm up, without saying a word. Thorn stopped. The 2 men looked at each other. The hall watched. "My pocket contains a personal letter," Thorn said. "It has no bearing on—" "Everything in this palace has bearing tonight, Lord Chancellor. Hand it over, or I'll have it taken." Thorn's jaw worked. The muscles in his cheeks flexed and released, the mechanical rhythm of a man calculating odds that kept coming up 0. He reached into his pocket and withdrew a folded piece of paper, creased and soft from handling, the kind of paper that has been read and refolded so many times it feels like cloth. Aldrin took it, unfolded it, read it. His expression didn't change, but his eyes moved to Darius, still slumped against the table, and held there for 3 full seconds before he folded the letter again and tucked it inside his armor. "Escort the Lord Chancellor to his offices," Aldrin told 2 of his men. "He doesn't touch anything until I arrive." Thorn was led away. The hall exhaled, not in relief, but in the particular way a crowd exhales when it realizes the pressure is building, not releasing. On the dais, Darius stirred. He lifted his head from Evelyn's hair and looked at the empty space where Celine had stood. His eyes were bloodshot and swollen, but something had shifted in them. The raw desperation of 20 minutes ago was calcifying into something harder, something that looked like calculation. He had been a king for 12 years. Fear had been his instrument, but it wasn't his only one. Beneath the brutality, beneath the swagger and the violence and the rooms full of men who flinched when he raised his voice, there was a mind that had survived a succession war, orchestrated the elimination of 3 political rivals, and maintained absolute control over a court that wanted him dead for over a decade. That mind was not gone. It was waking up. Darius pressed his mouth to Evelyn's ear. "Stop crying." She didn't stop. "Evelyn, stop. Crying. Now." His voice was barely audible, a whisper pressed so close to her skin that no one beyond arm's reach could have heard it. But the tone carried something that went beyond volume. It was the voice he used when the stakes were absolute, and sentiment was a luxury he had already decided to discard. Evelyn's sobbing stuttered, caught, held. She pulled back from his chest and looked at him with eyes that were red-rimmed and terrified and searching for something. Instruction, reassurance, a plan that he might or might not have. They don't have everything, he whispered. Celine is smart, but she's not thorough. She thinks the letters and the financial records are the whole picture. They're not. Darius, she knows about the poison. She knows about the heirs. She knows what Thorne told the physician. She doesn't know who supplied the compound. She doesn't know the chain. His hand moved to the back of her neck, gripping it. Not gently, not roughly, but with the specific pressure of a man holding something in place. The chain leads to Voss. Voss leads to the eastern provinces. If Voss keeps his mouth shut, the poison trail dead ends at Thorne and goes no further. And if Thorne talks, Thorne won't talk. Thorne knows that talking means admitting he facilitated the murder of royal children. He'll die before he admits that, because the alternative is worse than death in this court, and he knows it. Evelyn stared at him. Her breathing was still ragged, but her eyes had steadied, not with hope, not with trust, but with the grim focus of a woman who was beginning to understand that survival required her to think alongside this man instead of collapsing against him. "What about the letter?" she said. "The one she showed the court, in your handwriting, about the succession." Darius's grip on her neck tightened. One fraction, enough that she felt it. "I'll deny authorship. My hand is distinctive, but not unique. Lord Fairfax's secretary was trained to replicate my script for ceremonial purposes. I'll argue the letter is a forgery designed to frame me." Will they believe that? They don't need to believe it. They need to doubt it. Doubt is enough. Doubt slows the investigation, and time is what I need. Time for what? Darius didn't answer. He looked past her, over her shoulder, at the Mother Empress standing at the edge of the dais like a monument to everything he had spent 12 years trying to surpass. His mother. The woman who had handed him this crown and then spent every year since reminding him, in silences, in looks, in the 1,000 small corrections that accumulated like water wearing through stone, that she considered the handoff a mistake. He had always known she would come for him if she found the right reason. He had spent his entire reign making sure she never did. And now Celine, quiet, invisible, irrelevant Celine, had handed his mother the reason on a silver tray. Something moved in his chest. Not guilt. Darius had burned that out of himself years ago, the way a farmer burns a field to make the soil ready for something new. What moved in him was simpler and older. The territorial rage of a man watching his domain slip through his fingers. The fury of an animal that built its den with blood and bone and now smelled arrival at the entrance. He released Evelyn's neck and pushed himself to his feet. His knees ached. His coat was ruined. Wine had dried in streaks down the gold embroidery, turning the fabric stiff and dark. He didn't straighten his hair or adjust his collar. He stood as he was, wrecked, disheveled, stripped of every layer of presentation that normally stood between him and the people he ruled. "Mother." The Mother Empress turned her head. Slowly, the way a predator turns toward a sound it has already identified and dismissed. "I want to address the court. You have not been given the floor. I am the king. I don't require permission to speak in my own hall. You required permission the moment your queen produced evidence that you have committed treason against the crown. The charter is explicit. A sovereign under investigation for crimes against the imperial line speaks only when invited to do so by the presiding authority. Tonight, that authority is mine." Darius's hands curled into fists at his sides. The scars on his left knuckles, the ones from the duel that killed his brother, stretched white against his skin. "Then invite me." Isolde studied him. Not with anger, not with disappointment, with the clinical detachment of a woman evaluating whether an instrument she once built still has any use. "Speak," she said. Darius turned to the court. 300 faces stared back at him. Some hostile, some frightened, some carefully, deliberately blank. The faces of people who had not yet decided which side would win and refused to commit until they knew. "I have made errors," he said. His voice was rough but controlled. The voice of a man who has spent the last 20 minutes recalibrating and has settled on a strategy. "My relationship with Lady Marchand was a failure of judgment. I take full responsibility for the pain it has caused my queen and the embarrassment it has brought upon this court." He paused. Let the admission settle. Watch the faces shift. Surprise, skepticism, the faint glimmer of people who wanted to believe the situation might resolve itself cleanly. "But I want this court to understand something." His voice hardened. 1 degree, just enough. "The documents my queen presented tonight are a mixture of truth and fabrication. The financial records exist. The relationship exists. I do not deny these things. But the accusations regarding the royal heirs, the poisoning, the compound from the eastern provinces, these are lies constructed by individuals who wish to see this throne destabilized. The hall stirred, not dramatically, a subtle current, like wind through tall grass. Lord Ashworth stood. He was 62, white-bearded, and had served 3 monarchs. His voice carried the weight of institutional memory. Your Majesty, Lady Marchand herself confessed to the poisoning, before the entire court. Are you calling your own mistress a liar? Darius didn't blink. I am saying that Lady Marchand is a young woman who has been subjected to extraordinary pressure tonight. She was publicly exposed, publicly humiliated, and publicly interrogated while carrying a child. Confessions made under such conditions are unreliable. Any magistrate in this kingdom would agree. She named you as the source of the orders, Ashworth pressed. She named me because I am the most powerful person she knows, and she believed that invoking my authority would shield her from whatever punishment she feared. It is a survival instinct, nothing more. Evelyn, still standing on the dais behind him, made a small sound. Not a word. Not quite a gasp. Something between the two. The sound of a woman hearing the man she has given everything to begin the process of cutting her loose. Darius did not turn around. The Mother Empress watched this performance with an expression that had not changed since her son began speaking. She let him continue. She let him build his case, lay his foundation, construct his defense with the same strategic precision he had used to build his reign. She let him talk for 4 more minutes, about the complexity of court politics, about the danger of acting on unverified accusations, about the need for a measured and impartial investigation rather than a rush to judgment driven by emotion. And then she raised her hand. Darius stopped. Commander Aldrin, Isolde said. Aldrin stepped forward. He reached into his armor and withdrew the letter he had taken from Lord Chancellor Thorne's pocket in the hallway. He handed it to the Mother Empress without a word. Isolde unfolded it. Read it. The hall was silent, the kind of silence that has its own sound, a high-pitched ring that lives in the space between heartbeats. She read it twice, folded it, and looked at her son with an expression that Darius had never seen on her face before. Not anger, not disappointment, something worse, something final. This letter, she said, is written in your hand. It is addressed to Lord Chancellor Thorne. It is dated 8 days before the death of Prince Aldrich. She paused. The silence was surgical. It contains specific instructions regarding the preparation and delivery of a compound to be introduced into the nursery stores. It specifies dosage. It specifies timing. It specifies which staff members are to be removed from rotation to prevent detection. The hall didn't breathe. It is signed with your personal cipher, the one known only to you, to Lord Thorne, and to myself. Darius's face went white. Not pale, white. The color of a man watching the last wall between himself and annihilation dissolve into nothing. His mouth opened, closed, his hands unclenched. His posture, which had held steady through the entire performance, collapsed inward by inches, shoulders rounding, spine bending, the structural failure of a man whose foundation has just been pulled out from under him. That letter is, do not say forgery. The Mother Empress's voice cut like a blade drawn across skin. I taught you that cipher when you were 14 years old. I watched you practice it for 3 months until you could reproduce it without thinking. No secretary, no scribe, no forger on this continent could replicate it. It is yours. The letter is yours. The orders are yours. She stepped toward him, 1 step. The distance between them shrank from formal to intimate, close enough that when she spoke next, she was speaking to her son, not to the king. You killed your own child, Darius. You killed a 3-year-old boy who called you father, and you did it to make room for a child that doesn't exist yet. And then you stood at his funeral and wept and made me hold your hand while you wept, and I comforted you because I believed your grief was real. Her voice cracked. 1 fracture, thin as a hair, running through the marble of her composure. She sealed it immediately, pressed her lips together, straightened her jaw, rebuilt the wall in the space of a single breath. But the crack had been there. The court had heard it. And that sound, the sound of the Mother Empress's voice breaking for 1 fraction of a second, did more damage to Darius's position than every document, every letter, every confession combined, because it meant she believed it, completely, without reservation. The woman who had spent 50 years trusting no one and verifying everything had looked at the evidence and reached a conclusion that could not be reversed. Darius turned to Evelyn. She was standing where he had left her, 1 hand on her stomach, her face a mask of something that had gone beyond fear into the territory of pure, animal comprehension. She understood what was happening. She understood that the man in front of her, The man who had whispered strategy in her ear 5 minutes ago, who had told her that doubt was enough, that time was what he needed, had just lost both. Their eyes met, and that look was everything. The 2 years of stolen nights, the plans whispered in darkened rooms, the child growing inside her that was supposed to be their future, their proof, their justification for every terrible thing they had done. All of it compressed into a single glance that lasted less than 2 seconds and carried the weight of everything they were about to lose. Darius looked away first. He looked at the court, at the 300 faces that no longer showed uncertainty. The blank expressions were gone. The careful neutrality had collapsed. What remained was uniform, universal, and unmistakable. They knew. And above him, standing on the staircase that led to her private chambers, invisible to the hall, but not to the guards who had told her everything, Celine Ashford pressed the second letter, the one about her brother, the one she had not yet presented, flat against her chest, and understood with absolute clarity that the man she had married would not survive the dawn. But dawn was still hours away, and a cornered king, she knew, was more dangerous than a powerful one, because powerful men fight to keep what they have. But cornered men fight because fighting is the only thing left, and they don't care what they destroy on the way down. She gripped the letter tighter and started walking back toward the grand hall. Celine's footsteps echoed through the portrait corridor like a second heartbeat, measured, deliberate, each one placed with the precision of a woman who understood that the distance between her chambers and the grand hall was not simply a hallway, but a threshold. On one side stood the version of herself that had spent 7 years absorbing blows in silence. On the other stood whatever she was about to become. The letter pressed against her ribs beneath the fabric of her gown. She could feel its edges through the silk, sharp, insistent, the physical weight of a dead brother reduced to a single sheet of parchment, and a sentence that had rewritten everything she thought she knew about how far her husband was willing to go. 2 guards flanked the entrance to the grand hall. They stepped aside without being told. One of them, a young man with a fresh scar along his jawline, met her eyes for a fraction of a second. Not deference. Something closer to allegiance. The look soldiers give a commander they have chosen to follow, not because of rank, but because of what they have watched that commander survive. The hall had changed in her absence. The crystalline formality of the banquet was gone. Tables had been pushed aside. Wine pooled on the marble in dark stains no one had bothered to clean. The string quartet's instruments sat abandoned on the balcony above, their cases open, their owners having fled to whatever corner of the palace felt safest. 300 nobles still occupied the room, but they had rearranged themselves, no longer seated by rank or house, but clustered in loose groups that reflected the new geometry of power. Those who had already calculated that Darius was finished stood closer to the dais. Those still hedging their positions lingered near the walls. And those who had something to hide stood very, very still, hoping that stillness would make them invisible. Darius had been moved. Not physically. He stood in the same spot on the dais, but the space around him had expanded. The guards who had separated him from Celine earlier now formed a wider perimeter, and within that perimeter Darius stood alone. Evelyn had been taken to a chair near the eastern wall, flanked by 2 members of the Imperial Guard. She sat with her hands in her lap, her wine-stained dress darkening as it dried. Her face locked in the blank stillness of a woman who had run out of calculations and was now simply waiting for whatever came next. The Mother Empress remained standing. She had not moved from the edge of the dais in what must have been close to an hour. Her posture was unchanged, spine straight, hands folded, eyes moving across the hall with the systematic attention of someone cataloging every face, every whisper, every shift in weight. Age had taken many things from Isolde Blackthorne, but it had not taken her stamina for moments like this. She had been built for exactly this kind of night. Celine climbed the dais steps. The hall quieted, not immediately, not all at once, but in a wave that started at the front and rolled backward until the last cluster of whispering nobles near the far wall fell silent. She could feel their attention like heat. 300 pairs of eyes tracking her movement, measuring her posture, searching her expression for some indication of what was coming. She stopped beside the Mother Empress. Close enough to speak privately, but she didn't speak privately. She spoke to the room. I have one final piece of evidence to present. Darius's head turned. She watched the movement, the way his neck stiffened, the way his jaw locked, the way his eyes narrowed into the focused, predatory squint of a man trying to determine the caliber of the weapon pointed at him. He had rebuilt himself in her absence. The broken man weeping on the floor was gone, replaced by something harder and more calculating. His coat was still ruined, his hair still disheveled, but his posture had straightened and his breathing had steadied, and the look in his eyes was no longer desperation. It was assessment. I was dangerous again. Celine noted this the way a hunter notes a change in the wind, not with fear, but with the understanding that the next few minutes required precision. This document was discovered 3 weeks ago, Celine said. She withdrew the letter from her gown and held it in both hands. It was found sewn into the lining of a riding coat belonging to the king. The coat had been sent for repair after sustaining damage during a hunt. A loyal servant noticed an irregularity in the stitching and brought the contents to me. She unfolded the letter. Her hands did not shake. She had practiced this, not the speech, but the steadiness. Alone in her chambers, in the dark, she had held blank sheets of paper and forced her hands to be still until the muscle memory of composure overrode the tremor that wanted to surface every time she thought about what the letter contained. The letter is addressed to an individual identified only by an initial. It is written in the king's hand and sealed with his personal cipher, the same cipher the Mother Empress has already confirmed cannot be replicated. Celine paused, drew one breath, let it out. The letter concerns my brother, Lord Edric Ashford, who died 6 years ago in what was reported as a riding accident on the northern road. The hall stirred. Lord Edric's death was not ancient history. Many of the nobles present had attended the memorial service. The accident had been accepted as tragic but unremarkable, the kind of misfortune that befell young men who rode fast horses on dangerous roads. No investigation had been conducted. No questions had been asked. Edric was not a political figure. He was a 24-year-old minor lord with modest holdings and no enemies worth naming. His death had generated sympathy and then been forgotten. Celine read the letter aloud. Not the whole letter. One sentence, the sentence that mattered. The Ashford problem on the northern road has been resolved. Ensure the witnesses understand the cost of remembering. She read it in a voice that was flat and even, and completely absent of the rage that was burning through her chest like acid eating through cloth. She read it the way a court clerk reads a verdict, because the words themselves carried all the weight they needed, and adding emotion would only dilute their impact. The hall reacted, not with the shocked silence of the poisoning revelation. That threshold had already been crossed. This was something different. This was a low, spreading murmur that carried the specific frequency of collective horror. The sound 300 people make when they realize the floor beneath them has been rotten for years, and they have been standing on it the whole time. Lord Ashworth was the first to speak. His voice cut through the murmur like a blade. Your Majesty, is Lord Edric Ashford's death connected to the broader conspiracy? Celine looked at him. My brother was the only member of my family with the resources and the political standing to challenge the king's treatment of me. He had written to the Eastern courts requesting an audience to discuss my situation. 3 weeks after sending that letter, he was dead. The witnesses, 2 of the king's personal guards, were transferred to a garrison on the southern border within a month. One of them died in a skirmish 6 weeks later. The other has not been heard from since. She turned to Darius. Not with theatrical fury, not with the performative grief of a wronged woman seeking justice. She turned to him with the precise, mechanical focus of a surgeon, identifying the exact point where the blade needs to go. You killed my brother because he was going to help me. Darius stared at her. His jaw was working, that rhythmic clench and release that she had come to recognize over 7 years as the physical manifestation of a mind running calculations at maximum speed. He was looking for the angle, the counterargument, the leverage point that would let him reframe this the way he had tried to reframe the poisoning, as exaggeration, misinterpretation, the desperate invention of a scorned wife. But the cipher was the lock he couldn't pick. His mother had confirmed it, the court had heard her confirm it, and Darius understood. She could see the understanding arrive on his face like a shadow crossing a field, that this was the piece that sealed the architecture of his destruction. The affair could be minimized, the financial records could be disputed, even the poisoning could be muddied with claims of coercion and unreliable confessions. But the murder of a queen's brother, documented in the king's own hand, authenticated by the Mother Empress herself, that was bedrock. That could not be moved. His mouth opened. No words came. He closed it, tried again. Edric's death was an accident. Your own letter says otherwise. That letter could refer to anything. The Ashford problem could mean a land dispute, a debt, a land dispute you resolved by ensuring witnesses understood the cost of remembering. Celine's voice didn't rise. It dropped, lower and quieter and more dangerous than any shout. What kind of land dispute requires that language, Darius? What kind of debt? He had no answer. For the second time tonight, the king of the realm stood before his court with nothing to say. But this time there were no tears, no theatrical collapse, no performance of grief to soften the crowd. There was just a man standing in the wreckage of his own cruelty, stripped of every tool he had ever used to control the people around him, facing the one person he had spent 7 years underestimating. The Mother Empress stepped forward. She took the letter from Celine's hands, read it once more, and then turned to face her son with an expression that had moved beyond anger into something far more permanent. Verdict. Commander Aldrin, Your Imperial Grace, place King Darius under formal arrest. The charges are treason against the Imperial line, conspiracy to murder royal heirs, the murder of Lord Edric Ashford, and abuse of sovereign authority. He is to be confined to the Tower of the Eastern Gate under constant guard. He will have no visitors. He will send no correspondence. He will speak to no one until a formal tribunal is convened. The words fell on the hall like stones dropped into still water, each one sending a ripple outward that collided with the next, the impact compounding until the entire surface was in motion. Arrest. Treason. Tower. Tribunal. Each word a nail in a coffin that had been under construction all evening and was now being sealed shut in front of 300 witnesses. Darius's body changed before his face did. His shoulders pulled back. His weight shifted to the balls of his feet. His hands, those scarred, thick-knuckled hands that had killed his own brother in a succession duel, curled into fists at his sides with the slow, deliberate tension of a man whose body has already decided to fight, even though his mind has not yet issued the order. Commander Aldrin approached with 4 guards. They moved in formation, 2 in front, 2 flanking, the choreography of men trained to contain threats larger than themselves. Aldrin's hand rested on the pommel of his sword. Not gripping, resting, the difference between preparation and provocation. Your Majesty, Aldrin said, please come with us. Darius looked at the guards, at the commander, at his mother, at the 300 faces watching him with expressions that ranged from horror to satisfaction to the careful blankness of people who were already composing their version of this night's events for the letters they would send at dawn. And then he looked at Evelyn. She was still seated near the eastern wall, flanked by guards, her hands motionless in her lap. But her eyes were on him. Wide and unblinking, the whites showing, the irises dark as wet stone in the candlelight. She was watching him the way an animal watches a trap close, not with hope of escape, but with the desperate, irrational need to see exactly how the end arrives. Something broke in Darius. Not the way things had broken earlier, not the performative collapse, not the tactical vulnerability. This break was structural. It happened in the foundations of his self-concept, in the deep architecture of a man who had spent his entire adult life believing that power was identity, and identity was power, and the two could never be separated. I was wrong. They were being separated right now, in front of everyone, and the process was not clean. It was not dignified. It was the psychological equivalent of a bone being pulled from a living body. The sound it made was not audible, but everyone in the room could feel it. Darius moved, fast, faster than anyone expected from a man who had been on his knees 20 minutes ago. He twisted sideways, away from Aldrin's approaching formation, and lunged toward the royal table. His hand closed around the handle of the ceremonial sword mounted on the wall behind the king's chair, a weapon that was supposed to be decorative, bolted in place, never drawn. But Darius had replaced the bolts with pins years ago. A precaution. This kind of precaution that only made sense inside the mind of a man who had always known, on some level, that a night like this might come. The sword came free with a sound like a rib cracking. Steel caught the chandelier light and threw fractured reflections across the ceiling. Darius held it in a 2-handed grip, the grip of a man who had trained with blades since he was 8 and had killed with one at 20. His breathing was heavy. His stance was wide. His eyes were the eyes of a man who had crossed the line between rational self-interest and something older, something that lived in the brainstem and answered only to the imperative of not going down without taking something with him. Nobody moves. His voice filled the hall. Not with authority, that was gone. With volume. With the raw, animal force of a man generating as much noise as possible because noise was the last weapon he had. The guards drew their swords, 6 of them, 8, 10. The metallic chorus of steel-clearing scabbards rippled through the hall in a chain reaction that started at the dais and spread outward until every armed man in the room had his blade in hand. Nobles scrambled backward, chairs toppled. Lady Pemberton screamed once and then cut herself off as if someone had pressed a hand over her mouth. Darius backed toward the eastern wall, toward Evelyn. She was on her feet now, pressed against the stone, her guards having stepped away when the sword appeared. Darius reached her and positioned himself in front of her, between her and every blade in the room, with the ceremonial sword held at an angle that covered the widest arc of attack. "You want to arrest me?" His voice was cracking. Not with tears this time, with the strain of a body running on adrenaline and fury and the last reserves of a will that had nothing left to lose. "You want to put me in a tower? You want to take my crown, my name, my throne? Fine, take it, all of it. But you are not touching her, you are not touching my child." The Mother Empress had not flinched. She stood exactly where she had been standing, at the edge of the dais, hands folded, spine straight. Her eyes tracked the sword the way a chess player tracks a piece that has made an unexpected move. Not with panic, but with the cold reassessment of someone recalculating the board. "Darius," she said, "put the sword down." "No. You are making this worse." "Worse?" The laugh that came out of him was not a laugh. It was a sound that belonged in a field hospital, not a throne room, broken, wet, torn from somewhere deep in the chest. "What is worse than this, Mother? What is worse than being destroyed by the woman I married and the mother who crowned me in the same night?" Celine stood at the center of the dais. She had not moved when the sword appeared. She had not flinched, had not stepped back, had not done any of the things a person standing 15 feet from a desperate man with a blade should reasonably do. She stood with her hands at her sides and her chin level and her eyes locked on Darius with an expression that had nothing to do with courage and everything to do with exhaustion. She was tired. Tired of being afraid of this man. Tired of the energy it took to calculate around his violence. Tired of the way fear lived in her body like a second skeleton, shaping her posture, governing her movements, dictating which rooms she entered and how close she stood to the doors. She took one step toward him. "Celine, don't!" Lord Ashworth's voice from somewhere behind her. She took another step, 10 feet between her and the sword now. She could see the veins in Darius's forearms, the sweat on his temples, the way the blade trembled. Not much, barely a vibration, but enough to tell her that the man holding it was running on fumes, and the fumes were almost gone. "You won't use that," she said. "Don't test me. You won't use it because there is nothing left for you to gain by using it. If you hurt me, they will kill you before your arm finishes the swing. If you hurt anyone else, the same. The only thing that sword is doing right now is proving to every person in this room that you are exactly what the evidence says you are." She paused, took one more step, 8 feet. A man who answers everything with force because he has never learned another language. Darius's arms shook. The sword wavered. Behind him, Evelyn pressed her back harder against the stone wall, one hand on her stomach, the other gripping the edge of a wall sconce as if the metal could anchor her to something solid in a world that had stopped being solid hours ago. Celine looked past Darius, past the sword, past the trembling arms and the bloodshot eyes and the ruined coat. She looked directly at Evelyn. "Lady Marchand." Evelyn's eyes met hers. In that exchange was something no one else in the room could read. The particular frequency of communication that exists between two women whose lives have been shaped by the same man's cruelty, one as his victim and one as his instrument, both of them standing on opposite sides of a divide that he built, and neither of them chose. "Your child will not be harmed," Celine said. "Regardless of what happens tonight, regardless of what happens to the king, the child is innocent of its parents' decisions. You have my word before the Mother Empress and this court." Evelyn's face collapsed, not into tears, into something beyond tears. The muscles around her mouth gave way first, then her eyes, then the careful architecture of composure she had maintained since the guards took her to the chair. She slid down the wall until she was sitting on the floor, her gold dress pooling around her, her hands covering her face, and the sound that came out of her was not crying. It was the sound a person makes when the thing they have been most afraid of is suddenly no longer the thing they need to be afraid of, and the relief is so enormous it registers as pain. Darius heard it, heard the sound behind him, felt the shift in the air as Evelyn collapsed, and something happened in his face, a sequence of micro-expressions that moved too fast for conscious control. Fury to confusion to recognition to something that looked, for one instant, like the ghost of a man who might once have been capable of understanding what he had done. The sword dropped 2 inches, then 4. Then his arms lowered to his sides and the blade's tip touched the stone floor with a sound like a bell struck once and left to fade. Commander Aldrin moved, fast but not aggressive, the approach of a man disarming a threat he wants to end without blood. He reached Darius in 4 strides, took the sword from hands that no longer had the strength to resist, and passed it backward to a waiting guard in a single fluid motion. 2 soldiers stepped forward and took Darius by the arms. He did not fight. He did not speak. He stood between them with the slack, hollowed expression of a man whose body is present, but whose mind has retreated to some internal room where the sound of everything collapsing cannot reach him. They led him toward the doors, past the overturned tables, and the spilled wine, and the 300 faces that would never forget this night. Past the portrait corridor where 14 Blackthorn kings watched from their frames with painted expressions that suddenly looked less like authority and more like warning. At the threshold of the hall, Darius stopped. The guards paused. He turned his head, not all the way around, just enough to look back over his shoulder at the dais where his mother stood and his wife stood, and his mistress sat crumpled on the floor. His mouth moved. No sound came out. Whatever he wanted to say, whatever final word or accusation or plea was forming behind his teeth, died in his throat before it reached air. They took him through the doors. The sound of boots faded down the corridor. Then silence. The Mother Empress closed her eyes. For 3 seconds, the only 3 seconds anyone in the room had ever seen her with her eyes closed outside of sleep, she stood with her lids shut and her hands pressed flat against her stomach and breathed with the deliberate, measured rhythm of a woman holding herself together through force of will. She opened her eyes. Lady Martian will be confined to guarded chambers with access to the royal physician. She is not to be mistreated. Isolde's voice was steady again. Rebuilt. The crack from earlier sealed shut. The tribunal will convene within 48 hours. Every minister, every lord, every official who held authority under King Darius will submit to questioning. There will be no exceptions. She turned to Selene. The two women faced each other on the dais. The Mother Empress, who had ruled an empire, and the Queen who had survived one. Between them hung the weight of everything that had been revealed tonight, and everything that still waited in the hours ahead. Isolde studied Selene the way she had studied her all evening, but the quality of the scrutiny had changed. It was no longer assessment, it was recognition. You will need to be stronger tomorrow than you were tonight, Isolde said. Quiet. Only for Selene. Tonight you destroyed a king. Tomorrow you will have to decide what to build in his place. Those are not the same skill. Tearing down requires courage. Building requires something harder. Selene met her eyes. What does it require? Isolde did not answer. She turned and walked down the steps of the dais with the slow, deliberate gait of a woman who had been standing for too long but would never admit it. She crossed the hall in silence. 300 nobles bowed as she passed. She acknowledged none of them. Selene stood alone on the dais. The hall spread out below her, wrecked, stained, reeking of wine and sweat, and the particular smell that fear leaves behind when it exits a room. Overturned chairs, shattered crystal. The ceremonial sword lying where Aldrin's guard had placed it, its blade reflecting the chandelier light in a long, cold stripe across the marble. She looked at the mess, at the 300 faces looking up at her, at the empty chair where Darius had sat 4 hours ago, laughing, powerful, untouchable. The chair was just a chair now, wood and velvet and gold leaf. It held no power. It held no authority. It held nothing except the space where a man used to sit, and that man was gone, and the space was waiting. Selene felt the shift in her chest. Not a thought, not a decision, but something more fundamental. The sensation of an identity reaching its limit, and finding that the limit was not a wall, but a doorway. For 7 years she had been the queen who endured, the queen who survived, the queen who absorbed and catalogued and waited. That woman had done what she was built to do, and she had done it perfectly, and now she was finished. What stood on the dais was not the woman who had walked into this hall 4 hours ago. It was not the woman who had tucked evidence into her gown and steadied her hands and spoken with clinical precision while her heart tried to beat its way through her ribs. That woman had been a weapon, necessary, effective, and complete. What the Empire needed now was not a weapon. And the woman standing on the dais, looking out at the wreckage of a reign and the raw material of whatever came next, understood with a clarity that felt like cold water hitting bare skin that she did not yet know how to be what was needed. She knew how to tear down. She knew how to survive. She knew how to stand in silence while the world burned around her and not flinch. She did not know how to build. She did not know how to lead. She did not know how to walk into a room full of people who feared the crown and make them believe that the crown could mean something other than fear. And she had 48 hours to learn. Selene did not sleep. She sat at the desk in her private chambers with the curtains drawn and a single oil lamp burning low enough that the flame barely reached the edges of the room. Around her, spread across every inch of the desk's surface, lay the administrative architecture of an empire she had never been allowed to touch: treasury ledgers, garrison reports, trade agreements, ministerial appointments, judicial records. Commander Aldrin's men had delivered them in wooden crates an hour after the hall was cleared, each crate sealed with the imperial stamp that meant the Mother Empress had authorized their release. Selene read them the way a surgeon reads a body opened on a table, looking for rot, for damage, for the places where infection had taken hold and spread beneath the surface. And she found it, everywhere, in every ledger, every appointment, every allocation of funds. Darius had not merely abused his power. He had systematized the abuse, woven it so deeply into the Empire's operations that removing it would be like pulling thread from a garment that had already been sewn shut. 12 provincial governors appointed not for competence but for loyalty. Men who owed Darius personal debts and repaid them by looking the other way when crown resources disappeared into private accounts. A military budget inflated by 40%. The surplus funneled through Lord Chancellor Thorne's office into a network of shell holdings that traced back to properties owned by Evelyn's extended family. Tax revenue from the eastern provinces diverted to fund a private garrison that answered to no one in the official chain of command, a garrison that Selene now understood had been the muscle behind Edric's murder and every other disappearance that had been quietly absorbed into the Empire's machinery of forgetting. She worked through the night. Not with fury. Fury was too expensive. She worked with the cold, mechanical focus of a woman who had been handed a problem the size of a kingdom and given 48 hours to prove she could do something with it besides survive. By the time the sky outside her window began to lighten, not dawn yet, but the gray suggestion of it, the color the world turns when it is deciding whether to commit to mourning, she had filled 14 pages with notes, names, dates, amounts, connections. A map of corruption drawn in her own hand, each line tracing the path between Darius's will and its execution. A knock at her door. Quiet. 3 taps, spaced evenly. She knew the rhythm. It belonged to Marin, the woman who had replaced Evelyn as her personal attendant 6 hours ago. Marin was 50, heavy-set, and had served the Mother Empress for 20 years before being transferred to Selene's household with instructions that were probably more detailed than anything Marin would ever disclose. Enter. Marin opened the door and stepped inside. Her eyes moved across the desk, the crates, the papers, the lamp burning on the last of its oil. And she said nothing about any of it. She carried a tray with black tea and bread and a bowl of broth that steamed in the gray light. "The Mother Empress requests your presence in the council chamber at the 7th bell," Marin said. "The ministers have been summoned." "Which ministers?" "All of them." Selene looked at the clock on the wall above her desk. 2 hours. She had 2 hours to eat, dress, and prepare to face a room full of men who had spent their careers serving the king she had just helped depose. Men who might be loyal to the Empire. Men who might be loyal to Darius. Men who might be loyal to nothing except their own continuity. "Draw a bath," Selene said, "and send word to Commander Aldrin. I need the arrest reports from overnight. Everyone who was detained after the palace was sealed. Names, positions, and whatever they said when they were taken." Marin nodded and left. Selene ate the bread standing up. She drank the broth in 4 swallows, hot enough that it burned a line down the center of her chest. She did not touch the tea. Tea required sitting, and sitting required time, and time was the one thing she could not afford to waste on comfort. The council chamber occupied the western wing of the palace, a long, windowless room with a single table that could seat 30 and walls lined with maps of the Empire's provinces, each one bristling with pins that marked garrisons, trade routes, and points of strategic interest. The room smelled of old wood and ink and the permanent, low-grade tension of a space where decisions that affected millions were made by men who had never met any of them. Selene arrived at the 7th bell. She wore a plain dark dress, no jewelry, no embellishment, nothing that could be read as display. Her hair was pulled back from her face in a single braid. She carried 3 leather folios, each one thick with the notes she had compiled overnight. Her face showed nothing. Beneath the surface, her pulse was running fast enough that she could feel it in her fingertips, in her temples, in the hollow at the base of her throat. She acknowledged the sensation and set it aside the way a rider acknowledges a horse's nervousness without dismounting. The Mother Empress was already seated at the head of the table. To her right sat Commander Aldrin, in fresh armor, his face showing the particular kind of fatigue that comes from a night spent executing orders that will appear in history books. To her left, an empty chair. Selene's chair. The ministers began arriving. Lord Harwick, Minister of the Treasury, 60 years old, precise, a man whose face naturally arranged itself into the expression of someone performing long division. Lord Pemberton, Minister of Provincial Affairs, younger, nervous, his eyes darting between the Mother Empress and the door as if calculating which offered the faster escape route. Lord Vance, Minister of Justice, tall, thin-lipped, the kind of man who had never raised his voice because he had never needed to. And 8 more, filing in one by one, each of them taking their seats with the careful, measured movements of people who understood that the chairs they were sitting in might not be theirs by the end of the meeting. The last to arrive was Lord Greaves, Minister of Military Affairs. He was built like a wall, broad-shouldered, thick-necked, with hands that looked more suited to breaking doors than signing documents. He sat down heavily, and the chair creaked beneath him, and he looked directly at Celine with an expression that was not hostile but was very far from welcoming. "We're all here," Greaves said. "Let's not pretend this is a normal council session." The Mother Empress did not react to his tone. She simply turned to Celine and nodded once. Celine stood. She opened the first folio and laid it flat on the table. The room watched. Last night, King Darius Blackthorne was arrested on charges of treason, murder, and conspiracy against the imperial line. The evidence has been entered into the imperial record. The tribunal will convene tomorrow. None of that is why I've called this meeting. She paused, scanned the faces. Harwick, attentive, calculating. Pemberton, sweating. Vance, unreadable. Greaves, jaw tight, arms crossed. I've spent the last 8 hours reviewing the administrative records of the past 12 years. What I found is not a government. It is a patronage network designed to enrich the king and protect his associates at the expense of the empire. So began laying documents on the table. Not dramatically, efficiently. One after another, each one placed in front of the minister it concerned, each one open to the relevant page, each one marked with notes in Celine's handwriting. Lord Harwick, the Treasury has been operating with 2 sets of books since year 3 of the King's reign. The official ledger shows a balanced budget. The actual expenditures exceed revenue by 31%, with the deficit covered by unauthorized withdrawals from the Provincial Reserve Fund. Harwick's face did not change, but his hands, resting on the table, went still in a way that was more revealing than any flinch. Those withdrawals were authorized by the King's office. They were authorized by forged documents bearing Lord Chancellor Thorne's seal. Thorne is under arrest. His office has been searched. The original authorization letters are missing, which means they were either destroyed or they never existed. She moved to the next minister. Lord Pemberton. 3 of the 12 provincial governors were appointed without confirmation from this council. The charter requires a majority vote. No vote was held. The appointments were recorded as emergency wartime measures, but no war was in progress during any of the 3 appointment dates. Pemberton opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. I was told the council had voted in closed session. There is no provision for closed sessions in the charter. You either knew that and chose to ignore it, or you didn't know it and failed in your duty to learn. Either way, those governors are illegitimate, and their appointments are void as of this morning. The room shifted, not physically. The chairs didn't move, the bodies didn't lean, but something in the air changed. The quality of attention sharpened from cautious to acute. These men had spent years operating inside a system they knew was broken, and they had made their peace with it the way people make peace with weather, by adapting, by building shelter, by telling themselves that what they couldn't change wasn't their responsibility. And now a woman they had ignored for 7 years was standing at the head of their table, showing them the exact dimensions of the rot they had agreed to live with. Lord Greaves uncrossed his arms. You've been queen for 7 years and you've never attended a single council meeting. Now you walk in here with a stack of papers and expect us to take orders. Celine looked at him, held his gaze. Let the silence stretch until it became uncomfortable. 3 seconds, 4, 5, until Greaves shifted in his chair and the leather creaked beneath his weight. I have never attended a council meeting because I was never invited to one. The charter provides for the Queen's participation in all matters of governance. That provision was suspended by the king in his first year, and no one at this table objected. She let that settle. I am not here to assign blame for the past. I am here because the tribunal convenes tomorrow, and this empire needs a functioning government when it does. Every hour we spend arguing about credentials is an hour the eastern provinces spend wondering whether the capital has collapsed. She's right. Lord Vance's voice cut through the tension like a clean blade. He had not spoken until now. His thin face was angled toward Greaves with the detached precision of a man who made his living weighing arguments. The charter is explicit. In the absence of a functioning sovereign, administrative authority reverts to the Mother Empress, who may delegate as she sees fit. He turned to Isolde. I assume the Queen is here at your delegation. The Mother Empress nodded, one nod. That was all it took. Greaves exhaled through his nose, a bull's breath, heavy and frustrated, but he uncrossed his arms and placed his hands flat on the table, palms down. Surrender. Not enthusiastic, not willing, but functional. The surrender of a man who recognized that the power structure had shifted, and that his options were to adapt or be left behind. Celine spent the next 90 minutes dismantling and rebuilding. She voided the 3 illegitimate governor appointments and named interim replacements from a list she had compiled overnight. Career administrators with clean records and no financial ties to the king's network. She froze the private garrison's funding and ordered Aldrin to dispatch riders to the eastern provinces with instructions to place the garrison under imperial command or face disbandment. She directed Harwick to consolidate the treasury's books into a single ledger within 72 hours, with independent verification from auditors she would select personally. She did not raise her voice. She did not make threats. She did not perform authority. She simply issued instructions with the quiet certainty of a woman who had done the work, understood the details, and was operating from a position of knowledge that no one else in the room could match, because none of them had stayed up all night earning it. When the session ended, the ministers filed out one by one. Some of them glanced back at her. Most didn't. Greaves was the last to leave. He stopped at the door, his massive frame filling the threshold, and turned. "You're moving fast," he said. Not a compliment, not a threat. An observation. "I have 48 hours. You have less than that. Darius still has allies outside this palace. Men who weren't at the banquet. Men who command troops in the provinces and won't take kindly to their patron being locked in a tower. I know." "Do you?" It wasn't a question. "Lord Greaves, I have spent 7 years watching my husband operate. I know who his allies are. I know where they're stationed. I know which ones will accept the transition and which ones will fight it. And I know that the ones who will fight are already sending riders, because that's what Darius would have done, and they learned from him." Greaves studied her. The assessment took 10 seconds, longer than he had spent evaluating anything else in the meeting. When it was done, something in his posture shifted. Not respect, not yet. But the absence of dismissal, which in a man like Greaves was nearly the same thing. "You'll need the military's backing for the tribunal. Explicitly, not just Aldrin's guards, the full garrison command. Without it, whatever the tribunal decides won't hold past the capital walls." "I know that too. Then you know you need me." Celine met his eyes. She saw what was behind the statement. Not arrogance, not leverage, but the pragmatic calculation of a man who understood that loyalty in a crisis was a commodity, and he was deciding whether to sell it. "I need a minister of military affairs who serves the empire. If that's you, then yes. If it's not, tell me now, and save us both the trouble." Greaves's mouth twitched. Not quite a smile. The ghost of something that might become one if given enough time. "I'll have the garrison commander's pledges by midnight." He left. Celine stood alone in the council chamber. The maps on the walls stared back at her. Provinces, borders, trade routes, garrisons. Lines drawn on parchment representing millions of lives she had never been permitted to consider and was now responsible for protecting. The weight of it settled onto her shoulders like armor being strapped on by invisible hands. Heavy, necessary. Hers. A knock at the door. "Enter." Commander Aldrin stepped inside. His face carried the particular expression she had come to recognize over the past 12 hours. The look of a man bringing information he wished he didn't have. "Your Grace, we have a situation at the Tower of the Eastern Gate. Darius. The king has refused all food and water since his confinement. He is also refusing to speak to anyone except—" Aldrin hesitated. The hesitation lasted less than a second, but it was enough. "He will only speak to you." Celine's hands pressed flat against the table. She felt the wood grain under her fingertips. Cool, solid, real. "He says he has information," Aldrin continued, "about threats to the Empire that only he possesses. He says if you don't come to the tower before sunset, he will take that information to the grave, and whatever happens to the Empire afterward will be your responsibility." The clock on the wall ticked. Each tick was a small, precise sound that filled the silence the way water fills a crack. Completely, inevitably. Celine knew what this was. She knew it the way she knew the sound of his voice, and the weight of his hand, and the temperature of his anger. This was Darius doing the only thing Darius knew how to do when the game was lost. Flipping the table, scattering the pieces, and forcing everyone else to play a new game with rules only he understood. It was manipulation. It was transparent. And it might also be true because the terrible thing about Darius Blackthorne was that even his manipulations were built on real foundations. He did know things. He had spent 12 years accumulating secrets the way other men accumulated wealth, and some of those secrets were the kind that could crack the Empire open like an egg if they reached the wrong hands. "What kind of threats?" she asked. He wouldn't specify. He said only that they involved the eastern provinces and that the timeline is measured in days, not weeks. The eastern provinces, where the private garrison was stationed, where the compound used to poison the heirs had originated, where 3 illegitimate governors controlled trade routes and military access to the empire's most vulnerable border. Celine closed her eyes. Behind her eyelids, in the dark, she saw the face of her brother. Not the face from the memorial portrait, the stiff, formal, posthumous rendering that hung in the Ashford family hall. The real face. The one that laughed too loud and argued about everything, and once carried her on his shoulders through a thunderstorm because she was 12 and afraid of lightning, and he told her the only way to stop being scared of something was to get closer to it. Edric would have told her not to go. Edric would have said that walking into a room with a cornered predator was not bravery, but stupidity, and that the Empire's problems could be solved without handing Darius one more chance to sink his teeth into anything. But Edric was dead, killed by the man who now sat in a tower cell asking to see her. And the information, if it was real, if there were genuine threats unfolding in the provinces that she couldn't see from behind these walls, could not be ignored because ignoring it would make her the same kind of leader Darius had been. The kind who let people die because addressing the danger required doing something uncomfortable. She opened her eyes. "Tell the king I'll be there at sunset." Aldrin's jaw tightened. "Your Grace, I strongly advise against—" "I heard the advice. Arrange a full security detail. I want 8 guards inside the tower and 12 more outside. No weapons in the cell. His hands are to be chained to the wall with enough slack to sit, but not to stand fully. And Commander?" She looked at him. "If anything happens to me in that tower, the tribunal proceeds without delay, and the sentence is carried out by dawn. Make sure he knows that before I arrive." Aldrin nodded. He turned and walked out. Celine stood in the empty chamber. The lamp on the table had burned down to a thin blue flame that barely cast a shadow. Outside the window, the sun was crossing its highest point, which meant she had roughly 5 hours before she would walk into a stone cell and sit across from the man who had killed her brother, poisoned children, and spent 7 years treating her like a piece of furniture he occasionally remembered to acknowledge. 5 hours to prepare for a conversation with a man who had nothing left to lose and knew things about the Empire that she couldn't afford not to know. Her hands were not shaking, she checked, held them up in the lamplight and watched them, steady, still. The tremor from last night, the one that had come when she was alone in the corridor with no audience and no armor, was gone, and in its place was something that felt less like calm and more like the stillness that exists at the center of a wheel that is spinning very, very fast. Everything around her was in motion. She was the axis. 5 hours. She picked up her folios, extinguished the lamp, and walked toward the door. Somewhere in the eastern tower, in a cell with stone walls and a single window too narrow to fit a man's shoulders, King Darius Blackthorn sat in chains and waited for the woman he had tried to erase to walk through his door. And whatever he was planning, whatever final gambit was forming behind those bloodshot, calculating eyes, Celine understood with a certainty that sat in her bones like iron that this meeting would determine not just the fate of the tribunal, not just the future of the Empire, but whether the woman she was becoming could survive a room with the man she used to be afraid of and walk out as something he had never imagined she could be. The corridor stretched ahead of her, long, cold, lit by torches that threw moving shadows across the stone. She did not hesitate. The tower of the eastern gate smelled like wet stone and rust, and the particular staleness that accumulates in rooms where the air has no reason to move. Celine descended the spiral staircase with 8 guards ahead and Commander Aldrin at her side, the torchlight throwing their shadows in long, twisting shapes against walls that had held prisoners for 3 centuries. The steps were uneven, worn smooth in the center by generations of boots, and the deeper she went, the colder the air became, until her breath left her mouth in thin wisps that vanished before they reached the next torch. The cell was at the bottom. A single iron door bolted from the outside with a viewing slot at eye level that was currently shut. 2 guards flanked the door. They saluted Aldrin and stepped aside. Aldrin turned to Celine. His face was tight, the expression of a man fulfilling an order he had argued against and lost. "He's been chained as you specified, short enough that he can sit but not fully stand. His hands are in front, not behind. He asked for that. I allowed it because it makes no tactical difference with 8 men in the room." "Has he spoken?" "Not since we delivered your conditions this morning. He heard them, nodded once, and hasn't said a word since." Celine looked at the iron door. 14 inches of forged steel between her and the man who had shaped every dimension of her suffering for 7 years. She could feel her heartbeat in her wrists, in her throat, in the spaces between her ribs where the breath sat before she released it. She cataloged the sensation the way she had cataloged everything about this man, not to understand it, but to prevent it from controlling her. Open the door. The bolt drew back with a sound like a bone snapping. The door swung inward. Torchlight from the corridor spilled into the cell and found Darius Blackthorne sitting on a stone bench against the far wall, his wrists bound in iron chains that ran through a ring set into the masonry behind him. The chains pooled in his lap like dead snakes. He was still wearing the ruined coat from the banquet, wine-stained, torn at the shoulder where a guard had gripped him during the escort. His hair hung loose around his face, unwashed, the oil from the previous night's grooming now just grease. His eyes were open and aimed at the door, and when Celine stepped through, those eyes tracked her with the focused, unblinking intensity of a man who has spent the last 18 hours in the dark with nothing to do except think. The 8 guards filed in behind her and positioned themselves along the walls, 4 on each side, evenly spaced, hands on pommels. Aldrin remained at the door. The cell was large enough for all of them, but barely. The air thickened immediately with body heat, and the smell of steel and sweat, and the particular tension that fills a space when every person in it is prepared for violence. Celine pulled the single wooden chair from the corner and placed it 6 feet from Darius. She sat down. The wood was cold through the fabric of her dress. She folded her hands in her lap and looked at the man she had married and said nothing. She let him speak first because the person who speaks first in a room like this is the person who needs something, and she wanted him to need something before she gave him anything. Darius studied her. The assessment lasted 15 seconds, an eternity in a stone cell with 8 swords within arm's reach. His eyes moved across her face with the methodical attention of a man looking for weakness, the way a mason looks for cracks. Whatever he found, his expression did not change. "You look different," he said. "You look like a man in chains." His mouth twitched, not a smile. The reflex of a muscle that had once been connected to amusement and was now connected to something else entirely. "Fair. You said you had information about threats to the Empire. Talk." "I will. But first I want to understand something." He leaned forward, as far as the chains allowed, which was not far, but the movement itself carried intent. "When did you start? The evidence? The documents? The guards? When did you decide?" Celine considered not answering, considered giving him nothing, letting him sit in the dark with his questions unanswered, the way she had sat in her chambers for years with questions he never bothered to address. But she recognized the impulse for what it was. Revenge dressed as strategy, and revenge was a luxury she could not afford when the eastern provinces might be burning. "The night Prince Aldrich died," she said. Something moved behind Darius's eyes. A flicker. Not guilt. She had stopped expecting guilt from this man years ago. Recognition. The recognition of a player who has just been shown the move that beat him and is tracing it backward through the game to understand how he missed it. 3 years, he said. "You spent 3 years building this. I spent 3 years doing what you trained me to do. Sitting quietly, watching, learning the shape of everything you thought you'd hidden. You made me invisible, Darius. That was your mistake. Invisible people see everything." The cell was quiet. The guards breathed. The chains clinked softly as Darius shifted his weight. Somewhere above them, through layers of stone and mortar, the palace continued its transformation. Ministers being questioned, ledgers being audited, riders carrying orders to provinces that didn't yet know their king was in a cell. "The eastern provinces," Darius said. His voice changed, dropping from the personal register into something colder and more precise, the voice of a man discussing military logistics. "Governor Aldrich Voss commands a private garrison of 800 men stationed along the Thornwall Pass. Those men are not listed in any imperial registry. They answer to Voss, and Voss answers to me." Answered. Answers, present tense, because Voss doesn't know I'm here. The banquet was a closed event. No riders left the palace last night, which means Voss is operating on his last standing orders. Those orders are to hold the pass and await instructions. If 48 hours pass without contact from me, Voss's contingency protocol activates. Celine's hands tightened in her lap. "What protocol?" "Voss seizes the eastern trade corridor, shuts down all commerce moving through the pass. Every supply line feeding the capital from the east gets cut in a single day. Grain, iron, timber, medicine, all of it stops." "You built a dead man's switch into the Empire's supply chain. I built a guarantee. The kind of guarantee a man builds when he understands that the people closest to him are the ones most likely to come for his throat." His eyes held hers. "I was right about that, wasn't I?" Celine did not react. She sat with his words and measured them the way she had measured everything he said for 7 years, separating the useful from the manipulative, the true from the tactical, the information from the performance. What stops the protocol? A coded message, written in my hand, delivered by a courier Voss recognizes personally. Write it. Darius lifted his chained hands. The iron links caught the torchlight and threw small, cold sparks of reflection across the stone walls. I need something to write with, and I need a guarantee. You're not in a position to negotiate guarantees. I'm in the only position that matters. I have something you need. You have something I want. That's not negotiation. That's the only honest transaction two people like us will ever have. Celine felt the pull, the gravitational drag of his logic, the way he built arguments, the way other men built walls. Each stone placed with precision, each gap filled before you noticed it existed. She had lived inside that gravity for 7 years. She knew its weight, its texture, the way it bent the air around it until everything in the room angled toward him. She did not lean forward. What do you want? Evelyn lives. The child lives. Not in a dungeon, not in exile. They live in the Empire, under protection, with enough resources to raise the child without shame. Your mistress helped murder royal heirs. My mistress did what I told her to do. Every decision, every action, every step she took was under my direction. She is guilty of obedience. If you want to punish obedience, you'll need to execute half the palace staff. It was manipulation. Celine knew it was manipulation. The reframing of complicity as helplessness, the casting of a co-conspirator as a victim. She knew it the way she knew the sound of his breathing and the weight of his silences and every tactic he had ever used to reshape reality around his version of events. But she also knew something else. She had stood in the grand hall the previous night and looked at Evelyn Marchand and seen what everyone else in the room had missed. Not a schemer, not a seductress, not the architect of a palace conspiracy, but a woman in her 20s with a hand on her stomach and terror in her eyes who had been recruited into a powerful man's orbit before she was old enough to understand what that orbit would cost her. It did not erase what Evelyn had done. It did not make the poisoned children less dead. But it placed the weight where the weight belonged, on the man sitting in chains, not the woman carrying his child. Write the message, Celine said. Evelyn and the child will be relocated to a provincial estate under guard. They will not be harmed. They will not be imprisoned. But they will never return to the capital, and the child will carry no claim to the throne. If you're looking for a dynasty, it ends here. Darius's chest expanded. One breath. Deep enough that the chains shifted against his wrists, and the links scraped against each other with a thin metallic whisper. He let the breath out slowly, and something left him with it. Not defiance, not calculation, but something more fundamental. The last filament of a man who still believed he could control the outcome. Bring me parchment. Aldrin stepped forward with a writing kit. Parchment, ink, a blunt quill that couldn't be used as a weapon. He placed it on the bench beside Darius and stepped back. Darius wrote, "The chains made the process difficult, each stroke of the quill accompanied by a clink of iron. But his hand was steady, and the cipher flowed from muscle memory the way it had since he was 14 years old. He finished, blew on the ink, held the parchment out to Celine. She took it without touching his fingers. Read it." The cipher was beyond her ability to decode, but the format matched what the Mother Empress had described, the specific arrangement of characters and spacing that constituted Darius's personal authentication. "If this is false," she said, "if Voss receives this and the protocol activates anyway, or if there are additional contingencies you haven't disclosed, the tribunal will not offer you the mercy of a quick sentence. It's real." His voice was stripped. No performance, no angle. The voice of a man who had played his last card and was watching it leave his hand. "I have one more thing to say." Celine waited. "Edric." The name came out rough, catching on something in his throat. "Your brother. He came to see me before I gave the order. Did you know that? He rode to the capital and requested a private audience. Stood in my study and told me that his sister deserved better than the way I treated her. No threats, no demands. He just said it. Looked me in the eye and said it the way a man says something he knows is true and doesn't care what it costs him to say." Darius's eyes went to the floor. The chains hung slack from his wrists. His shoulders curved inward. Not the calculated posture of a man performing vulnerability, but the genuine collapse of a frame that no longer had the structural integrity to hold itself upright. "I killed him because he was right. Not because he was dangerous, not because he threatened my position, because he stood in front of me and said something true, and I couldn't tolerate it. That's what I am, Celine. That's what you married. A man who destroys things that are true because the truth makes him feel small. The cell was silent. 8 guards, and a commander, and a queen, and a king in chains, and no one breathed, and the torches burned without flickering, and the stones held their cold the way stones always do, indifferent to the confessions made between them. Celine stood. The chair scraped against the floor. She held the parchment at her side and looked down at the man who had taken her brother and her heirs, and her years and her dignity, and reduced them all to instruments of his own survival. She felt the grief. Not as an explosion, not as the breaking wave it had been the night before, alone on the floor of her chambers. This was different. This was grief that had been processed, compressed, folded into something dense and permanent that would live in her chest for the rest of her life. She would carry it. Not because she chose to, but because carrying it was the price of being the kind of person who loved people in a world where loving people made you a target. Goodbye, Darius. She turned and walked toward the door. Behind her the chains clinked once, a small, involuntary sound, as if his body had started to reach for her before his mind caught up and stopped it. She did not look back. The tribunal convened the following morning. It lasted 4 hours. The evidence was presented. Every document, every testimony, every letter. Darius did not speak in his own defense. He sat in the accused chair with his hands chained and his eyes forward and his mouth closed. And when the verdict was read, guilty on all charges, sentence of execution to be carried out at dawn, he nodded once, a single, small motion. The nod of a man who had known the answer before the question was asked. Eveline Marchand was tried separately. The tribunal reduced her charges from conspiracy to complicity under coercion, a lesser sentence that carried exile rather than death. She was escorted from the palace that evening in a covered carriage, bound for a provincial estate 200 miles from the capital, with a guard detail and a stipend and instructions never to return. She did not look back at the palace as the carriage pulled away. Her hand rested on her stomach. Her face was blank. The coded message reached Governor Voss 3 hours before the contingency protocol was set to activate. Voss read it, verified the cipher, and stood down. Commander Aldrin's riders arrived 2 days later and placed the private garrison under imperial authority. Voss was arrested without incident. He did not resist. The execution took place at dawn on the 3rd day after the banquet. The courtyard of the Eastern Gate was filled with soldiers, officials, and a crowd of citizens who had been gathering outside the palace walls since word of the king's arrest spread through the capital. Darius walked to the block without assistance. His chains had been removed. He wore a plain linen shirt and trousers. No crown, no embroidery, no gold. The clothing of a man who had already been stripped of everything except the body they would take next. He did not make a final statement. The executioner had offered the customary opportunity, and Darius had shaken his head. He knelt. He placed his neck on the block. The wood was cold and rough against his skin. The blade fell. Celine watched from a window in the eastern tower. Not the same cell where she had spoken to him, a room 2 floors above, with a view that encompassed the courtyard and the walls beyond it, and the city stretching outward toward the horizon. She watched because she owed it to herself to see the end of what she had started. Not for satisfaction, not for closure, because witnessing was a form of responsibility, and she had decided that the woman she was becoming would not look away from the consequences of her own decisions. When it was done, she turned from the window. Marin stood in the doorway with a tray of tea and bread. Celine took the tea, drank it slowly. The warmth spread through her chest and settled in the hollow spaces that the last 3 days had carved. The weeks that followed moved at the pace of reconstruction. Celine worked from the council chamber every morning and the Mother Empress's study every afternoon, the 2 women dividing the labor of rebuilding with the pragmatic efficiency of people who understood that empires do not wait for their rulers to finish grieving before they demand attention. The corrupt ministers were removed one by one, not in a single dramatic purge. Celine had learned from watching Darius that spectacle was the enemy of stability. She replaced them quietly, methodically, choosing administrators based on competence rather than loyalty, on record rather than connection. The Treasury's books were consolidated. The provincial governors were replaced. The trade routes through the Eastern Corridor were reopened under imperial oversight, and within a month, the supply lines that Darius had weaponized were flowing freely for the first time in years. The Mother Empress watched all of it. She attended every council session, reviewed every appointment, questioned every decision, not to obstruct, but to test. She was stress testing Celine the way an engineer stress tests a bridge, applying pressure from every angle to find the point of failure. She never found it. On a morning 6 weeks after the banquet, Isolde summoned Celine to the throne room. The room was empty. No ministers, no guards, no audience. Just the two of them and the throne itself, which sat on its raised dais at the far end of the hall like a question waiting to be answered. "Sit down," Isolde said, not gesturing to a chair, gesturing to the throne. Celine looked at her. "That seat belongs to the crown. It belongs to whoever the Empire needs it to belong to. Right now, the Empire needs it to belong to you. The Charter requires a formal transfer of authority, a vote of the Council, a coronation. The Charter requires those things, and they will happen. But this room is empty, and that chair is empty, and I am 73 years old, and I am tired, and I would like to see someone sit in it who deserves to before my eyes get too old to appreciate the sight." Celine climbed the dais. 3 steps. The same 3 steps she had climbed the night of the banquet, when she walked into a hall where her seat had been given to another woman and her husband couldn't be bothered to look at her. The same steps, the same stone, the same distance. But everything else was different. The woman climbing them was different. She sat down. The throne was hard, carved stone with a thin cushion that did nothing to soften the angles. It was not comfortable. It was not meant to be comfortable. It was meant to be endured, the way authority itself was meant to be endured, not as a privilege but as a weight that pressed down on whoever sat beneath it, and did not let up until they stood or broke. Celine placed her hands on the armrests. The stone was cold under her palms. She gripped it, and the cold seeped into her skin, and she held on. The Mother Empress stood at the base of the dais and looked up at her. For the first time in Celine's memory, Isolde Blackthorn's expression contained something that was not evaluation. It was not pride. Isolde was too practical for pride. It was closer to satisfaction. The satisfaction of a woman who had spent her life maintaining an institution and was now, at the end of her capacity to maintain it, handing it to someone who would not let it rot. "You asked me a question 3 days ago," Isolde said, "in the Grand Hall. You asked me what building requires that tearing down does not. I remember. The answer is forgiveness. Not for the people who wronged you, for yourself, for the years you lost, for the woman you couldn't be because survival demanded you be someone else. You will carry the weight of what happened in this palace for the rest of your life, and if you don't forgive yourself for the parts of it that were out of your control, that weight will crush you the way the crown crushed my son." Celine's throat tightened. She felt the grief shift in her chest, the dense, permanent thing that lived there now, the compressed weight of her brother and the lost heirs, and the years spent invisible in a palace full of people who could see her and chose not to. It did not dissolve. It would never dissolve. But it moved, made room, allowed something else to exist beside it. Not hope, not peace, but the possibility that those things might come, eventually, if she kept her hands on the armrests and did not let go. "I don't know if I can do that," she said. "You don't have to know. You just have to keep sitting in that chair and making decisions until the knowing comes. It took me 20 years. You might be faster." The Mother Empress turned and walked toward the doors of the throne room. Her steps were slow, slower than they had been 3 days ago, as if the transfer of authority had already begun to lighten her frame, and the lightness made her fragile in a way that weight had not. She reached the doors, placed one hand on the iron handle, and stopped. "Celine." "Yes." "The statues of Darius in the provinces. The people will want them torn down." "I know. Let them. Don't preserve monuments to a man who didn't deserve them. Let the people tear them down with their own hands and put whatever they want in the empty spaces. Markets, gardens, schools. Whatever a place needs when the thing that frightened it is gone." She opened the door and left. Celine sat on the throne in the empty room. The morning light came through the high windows in long, angled shafts that crossed the floor like the hands of a clock, measuring time in gold instead of hours. Dust moved through the light, slow, directionless, suspended in the warm air, the way memory is suspended in the mind, present but weightless, catching the light when it passes through and then disappearing when the angle changes. She thought about her brother, not his death, his life, the way he laughed, too loud, always too loud, filling rooms that were designed for whispers with a sound that didn't care about architecture. The way he argued, leaning forward in his chair with his elbows on his knees and his hands moving as if he could shape his points out of the air itself. The way he had carried her through a thunderstorm because she was afraid, and he was not, and he believed that proximity to the thing you feared was the cure for fear itself. I was wrong about that. Celine knew now that proximity to fear did not cure it. Proximity to fear changed it, transformed it from something that controlled you into something that lived beside you, familiar and manageable, a companion rather than a captor. She was still afraid. She would always be afraid. But the fear no longer governed her movements or dictated her silence or determined which rooms she was willing to enter. She had entered them all now. Every room in this palace, every room in this empire, and she would keep entering them, not because she was brave, not because she was strong, but because the alternative was to become the kind of person who let fear build walls between herself and the things that needed doing, and she had spent 7 years behind those walls, and she knew what they cost. The throne was hard beneath her, the stone was cold, the room was empty. Celine Ashford gripped the armrests and did not let go.